All right, welcome everybody to NIAC's panel today, Iran deal or deadlock? Why are the Iran nuclear talks stuck? My name is Jamal Abdi. I'm the president of the National Iranian American Council. I'll be your moderator today. It has been more than 16 months since Joe Biden took office with a stated commitment to restore US compliance with the Iran nuclear deal. And in spite numerous rounds of negotiations, and what is, for all intents and purposes, an agreement in hand, short a few remaining issues, the JCPOA remains in limbo. The final hurdle, apparently, is the Trump administration's designation of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, which Iran views as inconsistent with the agreement, but which the Biden administration insists can only be removed in exchange for additional non-nuclear concessions from Iran. To unpack where things are and where things may be headed, I'm joined today by three distinguished guests. Kelsey Davenport is the Director of Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. Ellie Garanmaye is the Deputy Director of Middle East and North Africa Program and Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Tyler Cullis is counsel at Ferrari and Associates. With their help, we're going to talk through the remaining hurdles to the deal, implications for US, regional, and global policy, as well as some of the non-proliferation benefits and issues that we may imminently face. So to start us off, I want to go to you, Ellie. The EU coordinator, Enrique Mora, is in Tehran right now for what I think he has described as the last-ditch effort to try to salvage the agreement. So I'm interested in your thoughts. What is Mora going to attempt to do with Tehran? Are there creative solutions available? Or is this simply setting the stage for the next phase of this adventure, which is a blame game and potential deterioration?
Sure, Jamal, and thanks for inviting me today. So listen, the EU, in their very special position as the coordinator of the Joint Commission set up by this nuclear deal, really since 2017, when President Trump came into office, have been trying to be the go-between from Washington on one hand and Tehran on the other to try and find solutions that can keep this nuclear agreement, preserve it, and salvage its structure. So they weren't able to do that under the Trump administration in terms of the US, preventing the US from withdrawing, despite the fact that at very high levels, they engage with President Trump on this at heads of state level. And really since then, and I think even today, what Enrique Mora is doing is try and bring the US and the Iranian position closer towards a middle ground compromise where the US can rejoin the agreement and the Iranians essentially roll back their nuclear activities. I think the EU has consistently shown that it is a good faith actor on this front in terms of trying to push and nudge everyone to a diplomatic solution. The European countries that are parties to this deal, UK, France, and Germany, have also really all under the Trump administration and for the past year under the Biden administration have been trying to find ways to convince the United States to come back into the deal. They're still part of it. They are, making their case as the US's close allies about why it's in their security and the US security for the United States to come back into the deal. Now, you pointed out at the main thorn here, which is, will President Biden take the very potentially political costly decision of removing the so-called FTO designation from Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps? And this is an area where, unfortunately, the Europeans and the EU cannot do much. It's almost a bilateral US-Iran part of the puzzle. They have in Vienna done their bit as Europeans to get all the brackets removed from the nuclear elements of this deal and the sanctions lifting elements of the deal, which is where they could make a real substantive contribution. But it seems right now the Europeans are very frustrated that, again, as this history of Iran-US has always been stuck in, it's a matter of politics, not policy. I think both the Iranians and the Americans know it's good policy for them to go back to their commitments under the JCPOA. It's a win-win situation, but it's really the politics at home on the domestic front that's blocking them. And what the Europeans are doing is trying to really come up with several different solutions. They've already floored several to see if they can get a yes from both sides. Unfortunately, so far, the formula hasn't worked for both Tehran and Washington, and they're kind of going back to the drawing table. And interestingly, it seems this time, this round, the Qataris are also getting more publicly engaged in this shuttle diplomacy. They're going to be visiting Iran at the highest level this week, and they're making a trip to Europe with ongoing consultations with the United States. So it does seem that a new round of diplomacy has picked up on this front.
And do you have a sense, I mean, is there a creative solution here? Are the Qataris potentially able to add new incentives, or is Europe able to add new incentives for Iran to blink on this question of the FTO designation? Or how is Europe able to kind of sweeten the deal for both sides to be able to say yes?
I think that the last number of weeks of real impasse on this issue have really proved 2 points. One is that the Iranians are not going to blink, and they're not going to just drop this demand for at least the substantive part of the IRGC to be removed from this very unprecedented measure that the United States took under the Trump administration, which was to essentially designate a foreign military under this FTO designation. They want that removed for a number of practical and political reasons. And on the US side, it's become clear that they don't see this as part of the JCPOA package. Now, whether that's wrong or right is another point, but they've made it very clear now that they want something reciprocal from Iran as part of a quid pro quo. Now, there's been lots of different face-saving formulas that we've thought about, people around this Zoom call, others, everything ranging from, well, maybe we can keep parts of the IRGC as part of the designation that have been involved in the regional activities of Iran, but remove the whole organization, or let's come up with some sort of a package that can be passed at the UN Security Council. So it's not a bilateral Iran-US measure, but a more international measure that can give Iran some cover. So I think there are creative ways beyond this also that are being thought about, and perhaps the Qataris can bring an interesting regional element to this, because the regional part of the puzzle has been something that the US has been concerned about, particularly Iran's activities in the region vis-a-vis US interests and assets. So, perhaps there is a give and take that can still be had on this front. I think for the Europeans, they would love it if the US and Iran would just find a common solution to this themselves. But it seems that there needs to be help from outside actors to get them through to the finishing line on this.
I do want to go to Tyler to talk through this FTO issue, but first let's kind of let's remind ourselves of the stakes here. So Kelsey, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what is the current status of Iran's nuclear program, and if the talks do break down, what does escalation potentially look like in terms of their program?
Great. Thank you, Jamal, and thanks to NIAC for hosting this panel. It's great to be here with Tyler and Ellie, and appreciate all of you tuning in today to listen. So the current trajectory of Iran's nuclear program really underscores the urgent need to restore the JCPOA and its limits and intrusive monitoring. And if we look at where Iran's nuclear program is now versus where it was 3 years ago when Iran began to violate the deal, or even back to 2013 when negotiations on the JCPOA really commenced, the threat is much more urgent. And Iran is much closer to a nuclear weapon from a capability perspective than it ever has been in the past. So just to give you an example, when the nuclear deal was fully implemented and Iran was abiding by all of its commitments, it would have taken Tehran about 12 months to produce enough fissile material for a bomb if the decision were made to do so. Now, as a cumulative result of Iran's breaches, that time frame is down to about 2 weeks, and it will continue to decline even more. So we're very close to the point where Iran could make the decision to produce enough fissile material for a weapon, and international inspectors may not be able to detect that. They could try to dash to this point between inspections. Now, if Iran gets to that point, it would still take them another 1 to 2 years to weaponize. But it's in producing the fissile material that you have a window to try to kind of detect and disrupt the dash for a bomb. When you have a window to actually act diplomatically to try to, roll Iran back. So my fear is that if we don't restore the JCPOA and we fall into that undetectable breakout period, the risk of the United States, more of a risk of Israel, trying to take military action or engaging in acts of sabotage to roll back Iran's program and increase that time frame begins to increase significantly. And in that scenario, I think there's a real risk of an escalatory spiral of actions leading to a broader conflict. So the risk really is quite imminent. Now, if the decision were made to halt talks, or if talks run out of momentum, you asked about escalation, and there again, the situation really is quite precarious. Iran could undertake no new nuclear actions, and its program will still continue to pose more and more of a risk. Because as Iran's program advances, it continues to stockpile more enriched uranium and uranium enriched to higher levels. Again, that would allow it to move to nuclear weapons more quickly. Iran also is going to continue, testing its advanced centrifuges, which are the machines used to enrich uranium. It's likely going to continue experiments with uranium metal, which can be used for nuclear fuel, or for nuclear weapons. All of these activities, if Iran even just continues them, will increase risk because, again, it reduces that breakout and it results in Iran gaining more knowledge about how these processes work. And that's just if Iran does nothing and sort of stays on the current trajectory. But if Iran wanted to ratchet up tensions further, it has escalation dominance in the short term. There are an array of actions that Iran could take to sort of further its nuclear program, and that it could do quite quickly. I'm sure more quickly than the United States and its partners could try to, reconstitute a diplomatic campaign to pressure Iran back into talks, or reconstitute international support for new negotiations. There are a range of activities that could be relevant to building a nuclear weapon that Iran could sort of begin some experimentation with under the guise of civil nuclear activities. A lot of these activities are prohibited or strictly regulated by the JCPOA. They could further expand their uranium enrichment capacity. They could reopen the plutonium pathway to nuclear weapons. So again, this just underscores that there's a range of activities that Iran could undertake to really ratchet up the pressure and to make the current crisis even worse. So to me, that again comes back to this critical point of the Biden administration needing to act, with more urgency and with greater political courage to restore the deal now, because this is the best opportunity we have to roll back Iran's nuclear program, to reintroduce intrusive monitoring and verification, and to ensure that Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon remain verifiably blocked.
Can you help me understand, you say 2 week breakout, which is not necessarily, that's not, having the bomb, but having the fissile material to be able to produce a weapon. How much shorter can that breakout window get? Aren't we in the danger zone now of, I guess we're not quite at undetectable breakout, but we're pretty close to it. So how much further can it get? And I ask that because you hear a lot of, the folks in Congress who oppose the negotiations, who are calling for Biden to abandon the negotiations and ratchet up sanctions pressure or some other means, seemingly without kind of this understanding that we're on a very, we have a very small window here. And so if there's a breakdown of the talks, Iran could quickly accelerate into this undetectable breakout zone. So what is that, how short does that potentially get where it is, I guess, an even more serious problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the real period of concern is if breakout starts to drop to below a week, because that's when I think you really do enter that period where there'd be a risk of breakouts between inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, because those inspections have been severely curtailed by Iran's breaches of the JCPOA in response to Trump's withdrawal. Inspectors used to have daily access to Iran's uranium enrichment facilities. Now they don't. So there's a lot less visibility right now, which I think which is unfortunate, because with less visibility, I think comes less assurance that breakout sort of would be detected. I think one of the main things to look for, though, is whether or not Iran takes any steps to prevent that breakout from falling further. And that's something, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of visibility on until later in this month, when the International Atomic Energy Agency releases its next report. Because there are a lot of assumptions that go into breakout. I mean, I'm calculating the breakout looking at how quickly Iran has produced enriched uranium in the past, how many centrifuges they have spinning, and then extrapolating the time periods from there. But if Iran wanted to, they could take some very small steps that would at least kind of preserve that breakout window. I'm not necessarily optimistic that Iran will do that. Iran does have some domestic legislation in place that requires it to meet certain thresholds for its nuclear program if the JCPOA isn't restored, and all of those, contribute to this declining breakout. So not to be a downer here, but yes, the situation, can get worse, and we're certainly headed, in that direction, and we're headed in that direction very soon. I mean, I think if we don't see a clear pathway to restore the JCPOA, within the, by, sort of late June, then, we risk crossing that threshold at which, the United States judges that the deal just cannot be restored, and it needs to change course. So time is very short.
Got it. I do want to follow up on this point of, at what point the deal cannot be restored. But now that we have a sense of the risk here, let's talk about the hurdle. What is preventing the U.S. from getting this agreement where we are getting the eyes on the ground and the inspectors and increasing that breakout window? So this FTO issue. So Tyler, can you walk us through the FTO designation? What is this designation? Why is it significant? And in practical terms, is it actually significant for Iran or the United States, or is it purely symbolic, as some have contended?
Yeah. So again, and thanks Jamal and Nayak, and very glad to participate with Ellie and Kelsey on this panel. The FTO designation is actually, it's an authority administered by the Department of State. So it's actually outside of Treasury and OFAC. And it was put in place around the mid-90s, and it's codified in the Immigration and Nationality Act, which hints at the immigration aspect, which has been a concern for Iranian Americans. Generally, there's three criteria that need to be met for an entity to be designated as an FTO. It needs to be a foreign organization that is engaged in terrorist activity or terrorism, or has the capability and intent to engage in terrorism or terrorist activity, and such terrorism or terrorist activity threatens U.S. national security. If those criteria are met, then the Secretary of State has the authority to designate a foreign organization as a foreign terrorist organization. The legal consequences of the designation are actually rather insignificant. And again, I brought up the time period of when this authority was put in place, because it really predates a lot of the sanctions authorities we use today, and it has much more limited effect than those authorities in place today. And again, there's three main legal consequences from an FTO designation. One is there's a provision of federal criminal law which criminalizes and makes unlawful and criminalizes the material support or the provision of material support or resources to a foreign terrorist organization. We can discuss this a little later on, but there's extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction. So it allows for any person subject to US jurisdiction that knowingly provides material support or resources to an FTO to be subject to criminal penalties. However, the phrase subject to US jurisdiction includes acts undertaken by a foreign national outside the United States. And those acts become subject to US jurisdiction if at any point in the future the foreign national enters the United States. And again, we can discuss what that means, but in practical terms, that means a foreign person outside the United States can engage in activity involving the IRGC. Neither the activity nor the person at the time are subject to US jurisdiction, but if that person travels to the United States at any time, they do, and that prior conduct does become subject to US jurisdiction. The second one is there's any representatives or members of a designated FTO that are non-citizens are inadmissible to and may be removable from the United States. And any US financial institution that becomes aware that it has possession or control of funds in which a FTO has an interest must effectively block those funds and report them to OFAC. Now, those are really not terribly significant sanctions consequences, particularly when we are discussing the case of the IRGC. If you look at the IRGC and its SDN listing, the IRGC has 8 program tags in its SDN listing on OFAC's website, which I think is a record. The only competitor would be Hezbollah. It is subject to sanctions under multiple legal authorities. Those sanctions include blocking sanctions, meaning any property in which the IRGC has an interest that comes within the United States or the possession or control of a US person must be blocked, which means that it's frozen and it would be reported to OFAC. It's blocked under multiple authorities. It's subject to corresponded or payable through sanctions, account sanctions, which means that basically if a foreign bank maintains accounts for or processes transactions involving the IRGC, they may be subject to restrictions on their ability to maintain accounts themselves in the United States. So the IRGC is not only not being banked by US financial institutions, the IRGC is not being banked by any non-Iranian financial institutions either. And there are also other authorities, including the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions and Accountability and Divestment Act, in which there are visa restrictions. And under that authority, I believe it's section 105 of the acronym CISADA, the Secretary of State actually has to make a list of members of the IRGC that would be ineligible for visas to enter the United States. That's a more limited authority, but a more targeted authority, right? So you're actually having the Secretary of State go out and identify members of the IRGC rather than having a blacklisting anybody who was a representative or a member of the IRGC at any point in the future or in the past. Now, I think what's holding for Iran, I actually don't think Iran is looking at this as a legal matter. I think I think Ellie hinted at this. This is really a political issue between the two parties. One is that the designation is a novel designation. No, the United States has not used its authority to designate a branch of a foreign military as an FTO in the past. The IRGC is the first instance in which it has done so, which also the United States has shown general reluctance to do so over the past 15 years, including under the Bush administration, to identifying the IRGC as a terrorist organization for this precise reason, because it is so novel to do something like this. I think Iran, does not like the reputational harm that comes with that novelty. I think Iran has a general grievance that, look, the United States withdrew from the JCPOA. It added a host of sanctions under its maximum pressure strategy. And, if we give in now, we're allowing them, because of their bad faith acts, to keep intact some of those sanctions. I think that is a deep grievance for Iran. And then the third thing, which, I've heard for a long time, but actually came out in reporting this week, which is that Iran had assumed that for a long time that the IRGC, the FTO designation, would be rescinded as part of a renewed JCPOA, and they believed that the United States had adopted that position in the negotiations. So it came as something of a surprise for them that this became as something of a last-minute hurdle that the United States did not feel as if it had reached agreement on the matter. And the United States believed it needed to extract some concession from Iran before it would be willing to lift the designation. And that makes it a real political struggle here, because it's really hard for Iran to give something up that it thought it was getting in return. Again, the legal effect is hypothetical. I will tell you that the people who advocated for an FTO designation of the United States believe the legal effect is real. And this goes back to the extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction issue. Because the IRGC has such an influence in Iran's economy, exerts a lot of ownership and control over organizations across sectors. It was believed that the idea of asserting extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction and rendering the provision of any material support or resources defined broadly to the IRGC or its affiliates, its agents and affiliates, would really inhibit foreign parties from returning to business as usual with Iran as existed, say, at the pre-US withdrawal period. So, there was a real reason advocates of the FTO designation tried to push this through. It was, again, believed that this would be a deterrent to foreign business re-engaging with Iran. I don't think it actually works out that way. I don't think many people outside the United States or even inside the United States are aware of this, of the potential consequences. I don't think there has been, I can't think of a prosecution, certainly not in the Iran context. It's really hard for me to think of a prosecution of a foreign national conducting acts outside the United States who traveled to the United States at some later date and there was an indictment waiting for him and he was arrested and brought to trial. I don't think there has been a case like that. So again, that legal consequence is somewhat hypothetical. And it's hypothetical. It could do a lot of damage to Iran. I don't think it will do it, and I also don't think that's why Iran is as aggressive as it is at the table. From the United States' side, very quickly, there's no benefit to keeping the IRGC attacked. And, curiously, the Biden administration has been using this as a talking point, even as it is decided that it needed to extract some extra concession from Iran before it would be willing to lift the FTO designation. You've seen this from Secretary Blinken, where he made remarks before Congress itself saying, the FTO designation does not add any legal consequences that are not already covered via other sanctions authorities or other sanctions imposed on the IRGC. Now, so that leaves really the Biden administration in a political, it's a political issue for them. And again, it's actually interesting if you actually look at the legal criteria for revocation of the IRGC. One of those legal criteria is, well, if they stop engaging in terrorist activity and they no longer meet the criteria for designation. But the Secretary of State can also revoke the IRGC's FTO designation if he decides it's in the national security interests of the United States. And he can also do so for any other reason. So there's no legal, there's nothing legally inhibiting the Biden administration from revoking the IRGC designation either. Secretary Blinken has been a little obscure in his remarks saying, well, Iran has to stop the conduct in order for us to legally be allowed to rescind the designation. That's not quite true. If he made a determination it's in the national security interest in the United States, and I think there's a very strong case, as Kelsey points out, that it is in the national security interest to the extent that it will inhibit the United States from achieving some core non-proliferation objectives vis-a-vis Iran, then he can rescind the designation. And again, that just leaves it purely a political matter for the Biden administration. It is concerned about the repercussions on the Hill from rescinding the FTO designation, particularly with midterms looming.
And just to be clear, I think some of the difficulties politically for the Biden administration may just be a matter of how this is being presented as removing the IRGC as a terrorist group. Now, the fact is, Iran is a designated state sponsor of terror. That is not being negotiated. That's not up for discussion right now. And the IRGC is, you named a lot of the authorities, but is designated under the specially designated global terrorist organization statute. Is that correct?
It's designated. It's a specially designated global terrorist sanction under Executive Order 13224, which was the authority after that the Bush administration inaugurated after September 2001. Ironically, that authority, Iran is not challenging its designation under that authority. That authority has much more severe legal consequences for the IRGC. So it includes a block on all property in which the IRGC has an interest that is subject to US jurisdiction. It includes correspondent accounting payable through account sanctions, meaning that basically the IRGC is isolated from the global financial system entirely because no foreign bank is going to handle transactions involving the IRGC. And also, to the extent that there's a conspiracy for the IRGC to funnel to try to engage in a currency conversion through US dollars or something like that, there's civil and criminal penalties for doing so. So the IRGC's designation under EO 13224 is of much greater legal significance than its designation as an FTO.
And so, okay, so I understand there are a couple of different versions of how this has transpired, this FTO IRGC issue. You've heard the Iranians believe that this was already part of what the US was willing to accept, and that this was somewhat settled, or at least was very much on the table. But other reports have indicated that there did seem to be a willingness by the Iranian side to reciprocate and to, in exchange, make some sort of private commitment to scale down activities in the region or de-escalate in the region. There's also this issue of Iran's targeting of US officials in retaliation for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. So apparently there was at least some attempt and understanding that there would be some level of reciprocity, but when it came to demands that Iran make those public or make more firm commitments, that this began to break down. And so I'm curious, with so much at stake for the US, but also for Iran, sort of what are the political calculations on the Iranian side? Why is this a no-go? Why is Iran willing to scrap this entire deal because of this IRGC designation, when compared to the other terrorism designations in place, it's actually somewhat meaningless? So Ellie, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what's happening inside of Iran. What are the political calculations of the negotiating team of the Iranian system, and sort of also popular opinion? We know that there have been recent moves that are going to make life even harder for Iranians, as subsidies for various government subsidies on food and other things are beginning to be lifted. So what are the calculations inside Iran? What are the dynamics right now that may be constraining their ability to make this important decision?
I mean, I think the number one question on top of their minds is, does the Biden administration and President Biden himself actually want this deal to go through? This was a big question mark when President Biden came into office, when we had the previous government of President Rouhani there, who was really ready and gearing to go to push this deal through the finishing line for the US to rejoin the agreement. Unfortunately, that wasn't feasible. And in Tehran, the view was that the US really dragged its feet in the first few months of being in office and gave a number of different justifications for that. Now, it seems what happened then is that in Iran, when the new administration came into office, from the Raisi government side, they also came in with issues that meant that the negotiations hit a wall to begin with, very maximalist positions. But since November, really there's been a much more realistic tone from the Iranians, and they feel that they have now conceded on several major points that they had in mind at the beginning. One was to have some sort of a guarantee, not in writing, maybe implicit, that the US, the next US administration would not withdraw from the agreement. And, back in the Obama time, when senators like Tom Cotton wrote letters to quote unquote the Ayatollahs of Iran to say that a Republican president would withdraw, we would all laugh and say this had no credibility. And actually, we now know this is very, very likely that if a Republican does take over, they could very easily undo any deal that President Biden goes to. So this is a major concession from the Iranian perspective that they've given in return for having at least, let's say, 18 months to 2 years of sanctions relief that they can bank on under the current Biden administration. The second point where they feel like they have made a major concession is on the point of damages, getting damages from the United States for the billions of dollars of worth of particularly oil trade that they lost out on. Even when the US withdrew from the deal, for a year, Iran was abiding by its full commitments. And so when the oil sanctions really came in under Trump, that's when we saw Iran starting to leverage up its nuclear activities for a potential negotiation. And this has been a major issue of, can Iran be compensated for that cost it paid? And it's continuing to pay right now, because let's face it, every day that passes by, they're still facing the maximum pressure campaign in terms of sanctions policy, at least on paper. So these are two major political points that Iran feels that it has already given away. And it has almost, US and Iran are always stuck in this ideological game that they play with one another. And this issue of the FTO designation has become one of the issues where they want to test almost the Biden administration's seriousness to get back into this deal and offer sanctions relief to Iran. And the sense is from the Iranian side that they have accepted to take major political blows at home for going back into this deal under what they view as quite favorable terms for the American side. Now, I just wanted to mention one thing related to what Kelsey said about the urgency of the situation for President Biden, because it does seem that President Biden wants to have a zero blowback policy on Iran. Some would say playing it safe, trying to keep everybody happy. But I think what has become very clear consistently on this issue, as we saw under the Obama administration, is that any deal, even if it's a short-term interim deal with Iran, precisely because it is with Iran as a counterpart, is going to receive major political blowback for any US president. And the question is, what is the best time to act as a matter of policy to get the greatest gains from a nuclear perspective on this issue? And with each day that goes by that President Biden delays this decision, I think the risks are becoming graver and graver. And it's not like he's going to somehow be able to win, for example, the more hawkish Democrats in his own party to come on board on a prospective deal with Iran. I think we've already seen that even under the Obama administration, there were certain senators under the Democratic side that refused the deal and will probably continue to do so today. But the risks are really piling up. Kelsey mentioned the risks of a potential military strike if Iran's nuclear activities continues to advance at this rate, not just from the US, but perhaps its allies, predominantly Israel. The risk of military escalation. We've seen things quiet down in the region, particularly over the month of Ramadan, but we've seen Iran demonstrate an ability to construct attacks into and out of Iraq, target Saudi Arabia through proxy forces. So that option is also on the cards for Iran if it sees that President Biden is not serious about a diplomatic pathway. President Biden promised to do a course correction on the nuclear agreement. He had a Democratic Party platform supporting him on this, and he's failed to deliver. And I think those are going to have, those steps are also going to bear a cost for him. And finally, I think that, President Obama, President Trump, they managed to bring home detained US prisoners inside Iran. And President Biden has failed to deliver on this so far. And this is because from the Iranian side, this is going to be part and parcel of a broader JCPOA deal that takes place with the US. So while the president is trying to play safe, not to have any blowback as he goes into the midterms, there are risks that are mounting up that could actually create much more significant blowback for him at home if things escalate on this front.
Jamal, if I could just jump in on that. I mean, I completely agree with everything that Ellie just said about the cost calculus. And to just put, an even finer point on it, I mean, Biden can pay a price for lifting the FTO, which I understand is politically challenging given Iranian threats against US interests in the region. But he can either pay a price for that, or he can pay a far higher price for being the president that allowed Iran to come to the brink of a nuclear weapon or started a war to try and stop that. And I think, if we look at that longer term, it's far preferable to pay a cost for lifting the FTO. And also just to bring this back to the JCPOA itself, we shouldn't forget that the JCPOA was narrowly designed to be a nuclear agreement to address a decades-long nuclear crisis, in part because every problem that the United States has with Iran gets exponentially worse with the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran hanging over it. So we have other tools to address regional tensions with Iran. We have other tools to address our concerns about the IRGC. But if we allow the deal to collapse, then we risk an IRGC that's further emboldened because of the standing of Iran's nuclear program. Would that push them to be more bold in the region, to further jeopardize US interests? I don't know, but that's not a risk I'm willing to take because, as I said, we have other tools to push back against the IRGC. We don't have another good option to address the nuclear crisis. I mean, restoring the JCPOA, is the only viable option at this time, to provide that longer term guarantee that Iran's pathways to nuclear weapons are blocked. So, I mean, yes, Biden may take a political hit for lifting the FTO, but I think he'll pay far less of a price for that hit than if Iran is allowed to reach the threshold of nuclear weapons status on his watch.
Yeah, if I could jump in too, Jamal.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with everything Ellie and Kelsey have said, and it is perplexing that the Biden administration has not been able to make the same kind of calculation that we're laying on the table right now. I think even a deeper irony about the Biden administration's fear of paying a political price over rescinding the FTO designation is that the Biden administration is going to pay a political price for rejoining the JCPOA, no matter what. That political price was built in to the manner in which Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed sanctions accordingly. Remember the sanctions wall, the idea behind the sanctions wall, which was kind of the concept on how the Trump administration imposed sanctions on Iran after its withdrawal was that, we're going to take authority. We're going to reimpose sanctions that were previously imposed for non-proliferation reasons, and we're going to impose them on terrorist grounds now. And that included major Iranian financial institutions, major players in Iran's, industries, who were designated under terrorism authorities. The idea being that the Biden administration, if it wants to rejoin the JCPOA, is going to have to bite the bullet and pay a political cost for doing so, because opponents are going to attack them for lifting terrorism sanctions in order to get back in the JCPOA. The IRGC issue is just the latest proxy in this fight. If Iran agreed, okay, we'll relent on the IRGC issue, you can keep it in place. Is there any idea that the political blowback is going to be anything different than what it's going to be? Because, as soon as we see in the annex the names of the, Iranian financial institutions, Iranian businesses, et cetera, that are removed from the sanctions list and that are designated under terrorism authorities, the exact same political fight is going to happen on Capitol Hill, no matter what.
we have a little bit of time for some audience questions, and I want to, the first issue actually I wanted to get to with Kelsey is how long can this drag on in limbo? How long can, you already stated, if Iran continues at the current pace, things are going to get very bad relatively soon. Is there a sense within the Biden administration that this is not as urgent as we've discussed? Is there a split about maybe Iran's willingness to go to that next level? And then I'm also curious, for the past 14, 16 months, there's been this talking point from the Biden folks that, at some point the utility of the deal is going to expire. Iran's program is going to become sufficiently advanced that the JCPOA will no longer be valuable. I've never quite understood that rationale, but I wonder if you could give us some sense of what the timeline really is for these talks to be able to conclude with an agreement.
Sure. So to perhaps take that last part of the question first, one of the common arguments against restoring the JCPOA is that it's going to expire, and that we've already wasted so many years. Why rejoin a deal that's whose limits will sunset? And I think that's a very poor argument against the JCPOA, because there are significant provisions within the deal that are permanent: the monitoring and verification, the prohibition against certain activities related to weaponization. So putting these measures back into place alone would have significant non-proliferation value. But where I think the administration is coming from when it makes that argument about diminished value is that Iran has embarked into some new areas of research and development surrounding its nuclear program, in terms of how it's enriching uranium, the machines it's using to enrich uranium, and some of its techniques for manufacturing nuclear fuel. And as Iran masters these new capabilities, it changes our calculation of the routes that Iran could take to nuclear weapons if it made the political decision to do so, and how quickly Iran could pursue nuclear weapons. So that raises the question then, given this new reality about Iran's nuclear program, is the JCPOA a sufficient bulwark against those new routes and pathways? So the longer Iran engages in these research and development activities, I think the more difficult it becomes to answer those questions. Personally, I think the threats from those new activities can be mitigated at this point, because Iran has not been engaged in them that long. It hasn't mastered these capabilities, and the other restrictions in the JCPOA are so strong. That those threats can be managed. But as I said, as time passes, that calculation, could change, and it could change for the administration. But I think, most concerning for the administration, is that undetectable breakout period, because that's the point at which the concern arises. Could Iran produce that fissile material for a bomb, divert it from a declared facility to an undeclared facility, and pursue weaponization activities that are much more difficult to detect, using traditional sources of intelligence. So, when the United States says that the time is short to restoring the JCPOA, I think they're largely referring to that breakout. Now, if, for instance, Iran did take some steps to try to lengthen that breakout, then I think, in the next, 6 months or so, you could get to the point where the administration assesses that the non-proliferation value cannot be restored because of those research and development activities I mentioned before. So again, I keep coming back to this point. The time to act really is now. And the time to take bold political, to take a bold political stance, for the Biden administration is now, because this is the best chance to roll back the program, to return, more intrusive international inspections and monitoring. Because, if we wait, there may not be a good deal to go back to.
We have a number of questions about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the international coalition imposing sanctions there. So I would like some general, any observations you have about how the situation has changed and how this may, hinder or potentially help. I don't quite see that, but the potential for an agreement. A few months ago, the talks were stalled because Russia wanted to ensure that the lifting of sanctions as part of the JCPOA would not interfere or not be interfered with by the sanctions imposed on Russia because of their invasion. Whether those were serious concerns or a leveraging and stalling tactic can be debated. But once that happened, the sort of anti-Iran deal echo chamber, who has been shifting messages every couple of weeks for the latest, to tack on to the latest crisis, started calling this the Russia-Iran deal, as if this was an agreement that was in favor of Vladimir Putin, some even suggesting that Putin was negotiating the deal. I think these are, kind of shameless and fact-free arguments. My interpretation would be that, and I'm interested in what the panel thinks, Russia probably has a incentive to actually not have an agreement, to have a Iran that is isolated and does not have incentives and abilities to engage with the West. But I wonder, for the panelists, what is your sort of interpretation? How has the crisis in Ukraine impacted these talks? How does it bode for coming to a conclusion with an agreement?
I can take a stab first at this question. So look, from my perspective, there's no doubt that the tensions, particularly between the West and Russia, are adversely impacting the ability to push things forward. You mentioned the 11th hour spanner in the works from this Russian public demand, which the Iranians had to then go to Moscow to get clarification and try and patch things up and push the Russians away from this position that could muddle the works even further for Iran to get sanctions easing from the United States. To my understanding, precisely because currently the problem is between the US and Iran on this issue, the political decisions, there hasn't been a huge amount of talking done at a technical level between, let's say, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese. It is, however, clear that things have become more complicated, let's say at the UN Security Council level even, for the West and Russia to work together on different conflict scenarios, let's say Libya or Syria. It's become, people are just sticking to their positions even more so, and there's less room for middle ground. Now, the only hope that we have on this front is that, looking back at the recent past, even under the Obama administration, the US and Russia were able to kind of ring fence the JCPOA away from their broader tensions. At the time, it was over Crimea, it was over Syria, and they saw a joint interest to contain Iran's nuclear activities. And Russia even saw, some political, economic advantages to being able to more freely re-engage in Iran. But right now, it seems that the Cold War mentality is back in both the Kremlin, the White House, and various European capitals. So this could open the space for more spoilers, even if the US and Iran are able to get beyond this FTO designation issue. There are very interesting conversations going on, for example, between Israel and the Russians on the regional issues, and probably more broadly, which no doubt will include Israel's interest on this JCPOA nuclear deal. So I would say there are some in Tehran that are very suspicious of how Russia could make its move. There are others that are more closer to the security establishment and actually, see this as a moment of opportunity for Iran to step away from the West and the JCPOA and actually consider cooperating much more closely with the so-called Eastern Bloc, Russia on security, China on sanctions evasions of US sanctions evasions, and on broader ways to immunize, let's say, their economies from US sanctions. So there are those in Iran who have been very opposed to the deal that are now saying, well, this is an opportunity for us to have a very strategic relationship with our Eastern Bloc and actually step away from this necessity of lifting US sanctions. I myself, given that the Vienna talks are not dead yet, and I think that, there are some very slight glimpses of hope from the movements from, the Europeans being in Tehran, the Qataris doing the back and forth. It seems that Iran still wants this deal, still sees it valuable to get US sanctions easing. And so there is still space for them to push through despite the broader global tensions. But I'd be very interested to hear Kelsey's thought on the technical cooperation with the Russians and Tyler on the sanctions front.
Sure, I can jump in there. So on the technical side, we can't overlook the significant role that the Russians played in the negotiations to finalize the JCPOA, and the role that they've played in working to find creative solutions to keep the diplomatic space open to restore the JCPOA. And the fact that the Biden administration was willing to provide some assurances that sort of the technical trade and exchanges between Russia and Iran to allow Iran and Russia to meet their commitments under the JCPOA if it's restored, I think that's certainly positive. Now, I would also just point out that, while it may be in Russia's interest for there to be, greater tension and discord between the United States and Iran in the region, it's not in Russia or China's interests for Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon or reach the threshold of a nuclear weapons status. I mean, that has profound implications for the broader nonproliferation regime that could then, challenge and threaten Russian and Chinese, security interests. As Ellie noted, when Russia in particular, joined the sort of international coalition pressing Iran to the talks and, in the lead up to the 2013 negotiations, it did so at great cost. And it actually, agreed, not to, sell certain military systems to Iran that weren't even covered by existing sanctions. So it went beyond its obligations. Again, I think speaking to that critical point that, nobody benefits from a nuclear armed Iran in the international community because those, not only because of the threat posed by Iran, but also those broader nonproliferation consequences. So I'm hoping that, we'll keep that constructive space open to finalize an agreement.
Yeah, and just quickly on the sanctions side, the Biden administration has not lifted the Trump administration's maximum pressure sanctions. What it has done is not enforce them to any extent, and we haven't seen, for instance, any new designations in quite some time relating to Iran. And enforcement is subject to diplomatic sensitivities and the availability of intelligence resources. Right now, we're seeing an enormous diversion of staff and resources at the Office of Foreign Assets Control into administering the Russia sanctions program. It's all hands on deck at OFAC for the Russia sanctions program. To the extent that we have matters regarding other sanctions programs that have been left on the back burner for months now, and we don't have any expectation that they will be dealt with soon. So it's hard to see how the Biden administration could seriously return to max pressure in a substantive manner, because again, doing so would require substantial investigative resources to be diverted away from Russia. It would involve intensive diplomacy with friends and foes alike, which could obscure some of the objectives that the Biden administration is seeking to achieve with respect to Russia. And it would involve a lot of public messaging on what the US's policy towards Iran is moving forward. And that's just not the kind of resources and staffing that either OFAC or the State Department has right now, with all of its focus being on Russia and Ukraine.
All right, we are at time. Could I quickly, Kelsey, can I just ask you, I think I want to gauge what is the next flashpoint here. So we've got the Mora visit this week. I think there's some pessimism about what's going to come of that, but we all will hope against hope. And then there's a Board of Governors meeting next month at the IAEA do you mind explaining that and why that may be the next flashpoint on this issue?
Sure. I mean, the next flashpoint actually might come shortly before the IAEA Board of Governors meeting, when the International Atomic Energy Agency releases its report assessing the status of Iran's nuclear program. And that's really going to give us a much clearer indication of how short the breakout window has fallen, or if Iran has taken any steps to mitigate that window. So that should be coming at the end of May. And then we have the Board of Governors meeting. And this is an issue that we didn't even get into, but the IAEA has been pressing Iran for answers about undeclared nuclear activities that date to the pre-2003 nuclear weapons program time period. These aren't current activities, but there is serious evidence that Iran did not declare all of its nuclear materials and activities to the agency as required from that period. And Iran's really been dragging its feet on that investigation and failing to fully cooperate with the IAEA. So if the IAEA determines ahead of that Board of Governors meeting that Iran's cooperation has not been sufficient, I think a number of states on the Board of Governors, including the Europeans and the United States, are going to have to look at pushing for an official censure of Iran, essentially condemning Iran for failure to cooperate with the IAEA. That's necessary to maintain the global safeguards regime. But it could result again in an escalatory spiral. Iran, I'm sure, will feel pressured to respond in some way. So again, I feel like I keep coming back to the same point here, but I really do think it is critical to emphasize just how short the time frame is and how critical it is that Washington and Tehran move with greater urgency to try to resolve it before these flashpoints risk collapsing the opportunity to restore the JCPOA.
Friends, thank you so much for joining us. Ellie, Kelsey, Tyler, thanks for your thoughts and analysis. Look forward to continuing this conversation with this urgent, ticking timeline that we have. Folks who joined, thanks for joining. In 2 weeks, we have another panel on sanctions. We'll be joined by members of American diaspora communities from countries that are under U.S. sanctions and talking about the U.S. sanctions regime and how it impacts ordinary people inside of these countries. So make sure to sign up for that. Hopefully we'll have some good news soon on the nuclear talks, but we'll continue our work for better or worse. Thank you all. Take good